Go out and help someone is the best we can do. There's someone who needs someone to help, you might too. We have our own ways of thinking, we argue about our views, but if we can put our...
There seems to be a niche of people in the area, even though we're in Texas, who are very, very concerned about the environment, and they seem to be coming out of the woodwork. And also from a personal point of view, I just retired as a physician, and I never really gave much attention to the environment or had the time to do that. So for me, this is just something that I can learn from. So this is our third lunchtime talk. The first one was given by Professor Emeritus Bobby Presley on Pollution 101. And the second one was given by Carolyn Ask, Director of the College Station Recycling. And I think a lot of us found out that we were not recycling very well. We were doing the wrong things. So there's a small group, and I think it's Terry who's going to be leading it, who want to put together a document that, really describes more how we really should be recycling. The things we should do and the things we shouldn't do. So today we have the honor of having Professor John Nielsen-Gammon here. I was trying to find somebody to give an introduction to this TED Talk, and everybody was busy. So I talked to a graduate student, Christina, who was here last time, and she recommended John. So out of the blue, and about 24 hours ago, I emailed him, and I didn't have to coerce him or bribe him or anything, and he was eager to come. So I was wondering if you could tell us what really piqued your interest in climate science from the beginning, and what kind of research you're doing, and then just go into an introduction of the TED Talk we're going to be listening to.
Okay, thank you. Well, first off, I'm honored to be your 28th choice for the speaker for this presentation. And my background is in weather and weather forecasting. Back about 20 years ago, we were trying to get a network of weather stations, automated stations, put in across Texas, something similar to what Oklahoma has, and that's operated out of the Oklahoma Climate Survey. And around about that time, the previous state climatologist at A&M retired, and I figured, well, if I'm going to be helping with Mesonet, may as well take the lead on the climate office. So I nominated myself to take over, and the department head forwarded it to the dean forwarded it to the president forwarded it to the governor gave it to someone and said, what the heck is this? And 6 months later, I was appointed. And then I gradually went through these stages of becoming a climate scientist, which is first step was being called a climatologist. Second step was doing research in climate. Third step was actually being funded to do research in climatology. Fourth step, getting published. Fifth step, being allowed to teach climate. So I've made it through all 5 stages of becoming a climatologist right now. Back in 2000, climate change wasn't such a hot button topic. So I probably couldn't be appointed today. In fact, the office probably wouldn't exist if it had to be created through legislative action. Fortunately, there is actually no legislative action that says there should be a state climatologist. So I'm sort of under the administrative radar in that sense, which gives me a lot of freedom in exchange for very little power. Not coincidentally, the talk you're going to hear is about power, power in terms of energy, and the mechanisms by which we would decarbonize our power sources, and how that is an essential element of dramatically reducing carbon dioxide concentrations. When I came into the climate realm, I started focusing on drought because that was the biggest climate issue in Texas. I also did some work in heavy rainfall, so I've gotten involved in that aspect of climate change as well. But I also do a lot of climate outreach, including presenting to agriculture audiences, water managers, Sierra Club, all sorts of different groups. So I've got a lot of experience talking to people about climate, including talking to people who in conventional lingo would be classified as climate deniers. But in my experience, just about everybody has some fairly fundamental misconceptions about climate change, no matter what side of the political aisle you're on and so forth, because that's probably true about science in general. You don't really understand string theory or why people came upon the idea of black holes as being something to exist. So climate is a complex thing. Why should the public be able to understand it from reading the newspaper and so forth? The answer is they don't. This I did not have to prepare this graphic for this talk. I actually prepared it for a previous talk a few weeks ago, but it is my representation of most people's conception of how they think about climate and climate change. And it's not quite right for two reasons. First reason is damages and harms associated with climate change, for the most part, are a continuum. They go from, you can attach value judgment however you want to, but they go from not very bad at all to really bad as you get to larger and larger amounts of climate change and larger rates of climate change, because we've had big climate change in the past, but they took tens of thousands of years. It was easy to deal with them. At least the ecosystem had an easy time dealing with them. Man managed to find ways of dealing with it also, and there's some hypotheses that form of climate change actually helped us develop intelligence because we needed it to cope with it. It's an open debate as how well we're using that intelligence to cope with the present climate change. The other issue that isn't reflected in the diagram is there actually are some tipping points where it's possible that we would get into some irreversible state that would cause major issues or major problems for humanity or for ecosystems or both. Except we don't know where those tipping points are located. We don't know how warm things have to get before we end up going over the edge. So in that sense, it's still a continuous thing, but it's a matter of the risk being continuous. The lower we hold the temperature, the lower the risk of crossing one of those unknown thresholds and having severe consequences. So I bring that up in introduction to this lecture because the conversation on the TED Talk, because it talks about climate goals and what we should do by such and such and such and such. And goals are essential for actually motivating behavior. But as you may have noticed with past climate goals that we have not met, it does not in fact mean we're screwed. Anything we do, no matter where we are in that continuum, is going to be beneficial. And consequently, while it would be great to meet the current goals of decarbonizing by 2050, even if we're not able to attain it, any progress we make in that direction is beneficial and reduces the odds of the really bad things happening. So that's how I want to lead into what your TED Talk you're going to play.
Well, do you have any, do you think that what's gone on with the pandemic and, with the lower carbon emissions, that could have some permanent effect? Or you think it's all going to be erased?
Well, as I understand it, the emissions declined by somewhere around 5 to 10% through the pandemic. Fundamentally what's happening with carbon dioxide, the primary driver of climate change that's going on right now, is we're taking carbon dioxide that had been removed from the atmosphere over millions of years, and we're pumping or mining out of the ground and releasing it into the atmosphere and gaining a lot of societal benefits while we do it. But so to the extent that we kept 1 month's worth of carbon dioxide in the ground, and assuming that the technology for allowing us to decarbonize and the policies for doing that aren't really affected by that, that's permanently 1 month's worth of carbon dioxide emissions we've saved. In a percentage basis of total emissions from present through 2100, it's a pretty small number. But as I mentioned, every bit does move the needle and reduces the impact and reduces the odds of catastrophic events happening. So I think it does have a permanent impact no matter what we do going forward.
Okay, well, so let's go watch this TED Talk and then we'll all come back for a discussion.
What does this all add up to? What's the takeaway?
I'm an optimist, John. I've seen this possible. I've seen when nations decide to do great things, they can do great things. I mean, think of America's rural electrification or the interstate highway system we built. Those are huge projects that transformed the country. What we did prepping for World War II, we built 300,000 airplanes in 4 years. So if we decide to do something, or when the Germans or the Chinese or the Indians decide to do something, other countries, they can get it done. But if this is sort of piffling around the edges, we won't get there. What do you think? Are you optimistic?
My take on this is I may not be optimistic, but I'm hopeful. I really think the crucial question is, can we do what we must at speed and at scale? The good news is it's now clearly cheaper to save the planet than to ruin it. The bad news is we are fast running out of time.
Okay. Well, how are we going to do all this? I just heard that Janet Yellen is proposing we have carbon taxing and that all countries do have that. Can you explain that and how would that work?
So at least from an economics perspective, the most efficient policy for, well, let's take one step back. The problem with the reason markets don't handle climate change on their own is because of what's called externalities. They get the benefit from emitting carbon dioxide, but the disbenefit and harm is external to that price. It's shared by everybody. So the concept of a carbon tax or a fee and dividend, for that matter, is to have that price be in the cost of the externalities, or the cost of emitting greenhouse gases to society, included in the price that people have to pay for it, so that the cost benefit analysis of decarbonizing doesn't have to be done from a policy perspective. It's automatic in the decisions everybody makes about where they get their energy or what technology gets developed is going to be most profitable in the future and that sort of thing. Individual nations or individual areas can sort of do that for certain sectors, but for example, in the United States, most of the products it consumes are produced outside of the United States, and so the carbon is generated and emitted elsewhere. So taxing the use of carbon really doesn't help here. You need to have other countries involved as well to actually affect the global markets. And you don't need all countries to be involved. You need the major economies to do it, because then it becomes economical for everybody to go along with it, because if they want to be selling to the major markets, they would have to do that sort of thing. There are two related reasons why it's been a hard sell so far. One is the word tax. People have tried to use different words. It doesn't seem to have worked yet. The other problem, which is related to that, is who gets the money and what do they do with it? So there's a very strong argument for saying, well, we should take the money from a carbon tax and invest it in clean energy technology and so forth, or pay the money out to the most vulnerable parts of society, either nationally or internationally, that are being affected by climate change. And the other argument is the history of taxing is the government takes the money and does what they want to. For example, the tax for state of Texas as an example, I think with state parks and so forth, where tax is set up and then money ends up going somewhere else. So the idea is it may be more beneficial and politically feasible to just turn around and pay the money out to the public on some sort of flat basis or something. So the government doesn't actually get any money to grab onto, and the public isn't paying anything as a consequence of having the carbon tax in place.
There is a project that I have been following locally. There is an entity, Texas Central Railway, is planning to build a high-speed rail line, at least initially, between Houston and Dallas, with a stop in Roans Prairie. And it will be running on electricity. And to begin with, even if it's using fossil fuel, high-speed rail uses something like 1/10 of the amount of energy per passenger mile than air or someone driving their SUV alone between two cities. And essentially, Japan Central Railway, with their Shinkansen system, is behind all this. And it's essentially, there are a lot of distance. I think this is a missing piece in our transportation system in the US, because there are a lot of cities where it's really too close to fly, too far to drive. And this could replace a lot of both driving and car trips for intercity flying and automobile trips between cities, but also it would be possible to build a solar farm and run the trains off of the electricity produced from solar or wind without having to make other major adjustments, changing out engines or whatever. So I'm throwing that out there as one idea. Seems to me a real win-win. And there are other city pairings in the US that are similar to the situation between Houston and Dallas, with relatively flat, inexpensive land in between. So.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything to add to that. The other place where that sort of idea is in place and perhaps moving a bit faster, or is California. You can imagine the political environment is somewhat more favorable in California, but on the other hand, the topographic situation is more challenging. The distances are greater, and you have to worry about putting rail lines across fault lines and what that might mean in short term and long term for high-speed rail. So it's proving to be a challenge in terms of the amount of money involved. I imagine for those sorts of reasons, Texas would be able to do it cheaper and have more economic benefits. So it makes a bit more sense to do it here.
It does seem like even a quicker and simpler thing, of course, a much smaller scale, would just be the Texas A&M shuttle buses. That's a perfect thing to electrify, since they're back at the bus barn most of the time. I don't know why they don't do that.
I believe now they're running on biodiesel, which is at least as good. because the carbon that is being emitted is carbon that the plant's already extracted from the atmosphere. So it's a net zero process. Although the problem with biodiesel is it produces diesel emissions beyond just carbon dioxide, which have health disbenefits.
Yeah, well, along that line, I found it interesting that the one guy was touting hydrogen, which is one of those things sort of like nuclear fusion that's, for the last 50 years has been 2 or 3 years off that will convert to a hydrogen economy. But it seems like you hear a lot less about that than you do batteries. But again, I'm no engineer. We need Mark Holtzapfel or somebody to compare batteries and battery development and energy density in batteries to hydrogen and hydrogen storage, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think the sort of situation where a massive breakthrough in batteries would reduce the need for a massive breakthrough in hydrogen, and vice versa. They're both tackling the same problem.
That's exactly right.
Since we don't have those breakthroughs yet, both of them need to be pursued, because obviously we don't know what we're going to discover.
Yeah. There seems to be more work on the batteries, although, again, there have been various companies around like Plug Power and what's the other big Canadian one looking at, using hydrogen and fuel cells rather than electricity and electric motors directly. And that you're exactly right. I think everybody's a little reluctant to put too much money and effort into a hydrogen and fuel cell economy if there's going to be a huge breakthrough all of a sudden in batteries.
Yeah, and another challenge related to either of those is I don't think the cost of transitioning the grid was really addressed in the TED Talk. Right now, we have gas stations everywhere, and we have power recharge sites for electric vehicles in relatively small places. So you've got this capital cost that you have to overcome. Once you're over that hill and you're built out, then everything is cheaper. But it's a challenge getting over that hump without not just price signals, but also policy signals.
What is behind our batteries shortage at this time? Is it just supply and demand, or is there something else behind it?
I'm not aware of a shortage per se. I know battery technology is relied on certain minerals, which there's not a diversity of sources for. So you can get bottlenecks in the raw materials with the present technologies.
Go ahead, Alan. Go ahead, Alan.
Well, we're not hearing you. You are unmuted, but we're not hearing you.
Not really addressed here, and that is all these developments take money, and 2.5 billion sounds like a lot, but it's really it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we spend on other things. And I know a lot of good ideas that people send grant proposals away to DOE, NSF, other ARPA, at really good ideas, but they just there's no money for that. We've got a limited budget, and I think this has been going on now for decades. I think starting around 1980, there was a sort of a big boost in research and in funding for renewables, but really that stayed pretty level, or since the 1980. And I think there's a lot of lost opportunities there. I think if we had invested back, 30 years ago, we would be way ahead of where we are now. And yeah, so it's the technology is there, the chemistry is there to make solid state batteries, which have a much higher energy density, much faster charging, don't use the same rare raw materials. But it's either companies are struggling to do this, or it's usually research labs somewhere in some university where they're having to write grants and and struggle and spend a lot of time for small amounts of money for something that really could have big impacts. So I think with the carbon fee and dividend, it doesn't have to be an either or thing. I think that it's a good idea to have a set dividend, like the Alaska payments, right, where everybody gets a certain amount. But some small, it's a big pot of money. Some small amount could go to research, and some maybe not so small amount could go to mitigating effects in other countries around the world and helping them with climatization, as well as mitigation. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
There's sort of a cottage industry in trying to find parallels between the COVID pandemic and climate change. And the parallel that strikes me is that if you really need to find $2 trillion lying around, you can do it.
Apparently, yeah. Apparently, it's.
I never knew that until this year.
And you mentioned that the cost for grid conversion. I've heard estimates. I don't know if they're still good, but I've heard estimates of around $2 trillion to do grid conversion so that we could go completely. And everyone's thinking $2 trillion is a hell of a lot, right? We could never do that. But now all of a sudden, yes, somehow, $2 trillion. When the cause is right, I guess, if there's enough support for it, it seems to appear.
I guess somebody just prints more and more dollar bills.
Well, yeah, it's bigger and bigger deficits is what it is.
Right.
Yeah.
So, are there any bills that we should be looking at as far as environmental bills that are coming up? Miranda or Jerry or Donna, do you have any suggestions on what we should be focusing on this legislative session?
Well, I know that the bipartisan group in the House for several years now, they've renewed every year the I can't remember the bill number. Sorry, I didn't check all this before the meeting. It's essentially a carbon fee and dividend act, but it has bipartisan support and has had for several years. There's a similar one in the Senate. I'm sorry, I can't remember the bill numbers offhand. And of course, they're in the process of being renewed for this year. So the number may change slightly. But I know that that's underway, and our local citizens climate lobby has been promoting that, contacting our representatives to encourage them to work on that. And because it's bipartisan, that's certainly something for me that's really important.
Yeah, that seems to be the way the government's going now.
One hopes.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions or would like to make comments? We're getting to our time. Yes.
Oh, actually, one other thing, of course, which is very much at the forefront right now in Texas politics, is the hearings on redistricting. And I would encourage everyone to look at that and contact your representative. John Rainey or Kyle Casal in the House and Charles Shortner in the Senate, to encourage them to do bipartisan focus, clear, transparent, bipartisan work on redistricting. Always in Texas, it's been whichever party is in power, when it's time to redraw those maps, they're drawn in the favor of that party. So thanks, Pam.
Miranda just said it's HR 763, Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act.
Thanks, Miranda.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone who attended, and thank you very much, John, for being here on such short notice. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, I happen to be in the neighborhood, so.
Yeah. Our next talk will be in 2 weeks, and that'll be Jennifer Nations. She's the College Station Water Resource Coordinator, and it's entitled Conserve and Save Money. And then on February 25th, it's a Wednesday, not a Thursday, Professor Gunnar Shade from Texas A&M.
That is Gunnar Schade.
Shada, okay.
Gunnar Schade, yes.
Shada. Okay, he's going to tell us about the good news, how the energy transition will eventually affect climate change or stop climate change. That's on March 10th. So, okay, well, thank you everybody for coming, and we'll all just say bye. Thank you again, John.
You're welcome.
Go out and help someone is the best we can do. There's someone who needs someone